Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. The street was dark, except for the occasional flicker of the street lamps that barely cut through the night. I had taken the long way home from my friend's house, down the quiet back roads that winded through patches of woods. The air felt heavy, and the silence outside my car was suffocating, as if the world were holding its breath. I was about halfway home when the car's headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. I hit the brakes, the tires squealing in protest as I stopped just inches from what I now saw was a woman. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was dark, tangled, and her face was turned away from me, looking down at the pavement. I rolled the window down, the cold air biting at my skin. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The woman didn't move or respond. I squinted, trying to make out her face, but the shadows hid it. A chill ran through me, but I told myself I was being silly. Maybe she was lost, maybe in trouble. Just as I was about to call out again, she turned. The face that met my eyes was pale and cracked, like an old porcelain doll. Her eyes were black and hollow, and the corners of her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My heart clenched. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and sped away, glancing back in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing still, unmoving, watching as the distance grew between us. The last thing I saw was her head tilting to the side, an unsettling, broken motion. I didn't take the usual way home after that. I drove faster, glancing over my shoulder, ears straining for the sound of footsteps, or worse, the whisper of someone breathing behind me. The radio crackled, the only noise besides the sound of tires on pavement, and I twisted the dial, searching for something that would chase away the tightness in my chest. Suddenly, my headlights caught something else, another figure, this time in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his hair matted and eyes sunken. He raised a hand, motioning for me to stop. I didn't. I slammed my foot on the gas, my car roaring as it sped past him. In the rearview mirror, the man and the woman stood side by side, staring. A sharp, inhuman cry broke the night, and I couldn't help but shudder. The road ahead was dark, unlit except for the dim glow of the moon. I turned left at the next intersection, taking a path that led deeper into the woods. I knew it wasn't the right choice, but the thought of going back that way was worse. The trees pressed in on me, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me out. I drove faster, ignoring the warning signs that read dead end. I didn't care. I had to get away. But as I rounded the bend, the road stopped abruptly, and the car skidded to a halt at the edge of a shallow, rocky ravine. I slammed my hands against the wheel, breathing fast, eyes darting around. In the darkness, I saw movement. 3 figures, no longer at the edge of the road but in the clearing behind me. Their faces were pale, eyes dark and hollow. The woman in white stepped forward, and a voice, soft and cold, whispered from the shadows, "Leave this place." I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and sped forward, ignoring the gravel bit at the tires. The figures didn't follow. I didn't look back as the trees blurred past, but I knew they were watching, waiting, and whatever they were would always be there, hidden in the dark corners of the woods. The rest of the drive home was a blur, my mind screaming for me to stop thinking, stop looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my house, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, and drew the curtains tight. The world outside was safe, or so I thought. The next morning, when I went to leave for work, I noticed the street was silent, as if it had never been touched by light or life. And when I looked out the window, I saw the woman in white standing across the road, staring at me, eyes hollow, mouth cracked in that twisted grin. I knew I'd never be the same again. The silence outside whispered that they were still there, waiting for the night. The summer I was 13, I stayed with my grandparents on their farm. It was a different world from the city. Vast fields stretching out beyond the horizon, towering corn stalks whispering in the wind, and that deep, oppressive silence that made you feel like you were the only person left on Earth. I loved it, most of the time. But that summer, something changed. My grandpa was a man of few words, the kind who spoke only when he needed to. He'd tell me stories about the land, about the time the creek had overflowed and swallowed part of the cornfield, or the time he'd caught a raccoon stealing eggs. But there was one story he never told me, not until that summer. It was late in the evening, the sky streaked with bruised purple and fading orange. I had just finished helping Grandma with the dishes when Grandpa called me out to the back porch. He was staring at the woods that bordered their property, eyes squinting into the fading light. "Do you see that, boy?" he asked. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the tall, dark trees, their branches creaking in the breeze. "See what, Grandpa?" He didn't answer right away. Then he turned to me, his face serious. "There's something in the woods. Always there, waiting. I saw it when I was a boy, and I swore I'd never go back." I laughed nervously, but the look in his eyes made my laughter die in my throat. It wasn't like him to joke about things like this. I glanced back at the woods, a chill snaking down my spine. "You're just playing with me, Grandpa. There's nothing out there." "Are you sure about that?" His voice dropped to a whisper. I noticed then that the wind had stopped. The silence felt thick, suffocating. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, strong enough to rattle the old wooden slats of the porch. That's when I heard a soft rustling coming from the woods, like something, or someone, was moving. I squinted into the twilight, heart pounding as I tried to make out any shape. But the trees remained still, their branches reaching like skeletal arms. "You need to go inside," Grandpa said, pushing me toward the door. There was something in his voice that made me hesitate. This wasn't like him. He was never afraid of anything. But there was a tension in his shoulders, a fear I'd never seen before. I didn't argue. I darted inside, casting one last glance at the woods before Grandma gently shut the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes wide, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps just beyond my window. Soft, deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I got up slowly, heart pounding as I crept to the window and peeked outside. The moon was high, casting everything in silver light. And there, at the edge of the woods, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Its head tilted, as if it knew I was watching, and it stared back at me with eyes that glowed a pale, sickly green. I backed away, breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled over the rug, hitting the floor with a thud. Grandma rushed in moments later, her face lined with concern. "What's wrong, honey?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the window, where the figure was now gone, swallowed back into the dark. The next morning, Grandpa was already up when I found him, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. His hands were shaking slightly, and he avoided my gaze. "It comes every so often, but it's never this close," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I thought it had forgotten about us. It was then that I realized what he meant. The creature in the woods wasn't just a tale. It was real, and it was waiting for us to come out again. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat by the window, hoping against hope that whatever had watched me last night wouldn't come back. But I knew it would. I knew it was already out there, waiting for the next time the wind died down and the silence came, thick and suffocating. The first time I noticed it, I was alone in the park. It was a warm spring evening, the kind that makes you forget the stress of daily life and think that maybe everything's going to be okay. I sat on one of the old benches, staring out at the lake as the last rays of sunlight bounced off the water's surface. The sound of children playing in the distance and the soft rustling of the leaves should have been comforting, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. The park was nearly empty, save for an old man who was feeding the ducks and a young couple holding hands near the picnic tables. As the sun sank lower, a strange quiet fell over the area, almost as if the world was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the figure standing on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it was a shadow. It was tall, unmoving, with the outline of a person, but it was shrouded in darkness. Even though the last golden rays of sunlight still clung to the trees, I squinted, my heart beginning to pound as I realized the figure was staring straight at me. I looked away quickly, telling myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I glanced back a moment later, it was closer, just barely, but unmistakably so. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood up and started walking toward the park exit. My pace quickened as I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew I was being followed. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the park was safe, but each step I took felt heavier, like the air around me was thickening, making it harder to move. I reached the gates and glanced back. The figure was no longer just standing, it was now moving, fast and awkward, like its limbs were too long and bent in unnatural ways. It wasn't running, but it moved quickly, closing the distance in a way that made me feel hunted. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock it. The screen stayed black, no matter how hard I pressed. My stomach twisted in fear, and I forced myself to break into a run, charging toward the street where the lights were brighter and the cars passed with a reassuring hum. I didn't dare look behind me. I reached the sidewalk, gasping, but I couldn't stop running. Only when I heard the sound of tires screeching around a corner did I turn my head. The figure was still at the edge of the park, staring at me, unmoving once more. I caught the gleam of its eyes that seemed far too wide, almost like they'd been carved into its face. A car honked, startling me, and I spun away, hurling myself into the street. I barely caught sight of the driver's panicked face before the headlights blinded me, and I screamed out. Everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed hours later, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nose. I could hear people talking outside the room, muffled and distant. My head throbbed, but I sat up as best I could, trying to remember what had happened. A nurse came in and smiled sympathetically. "You're awake. You were hit by a car, but you're okay. Just a concussion. Some scrapes. You're lucky." I wanted to tell her about the figure, how it had followed me, but when I tried to speak, my throat felt dry, and words didn't come. Something else caught my eye, and I froze. The window was open a crack, and on the ledge, a smear of dark red was visible, as if someone had pressed a hand there and left it behind. And then I noticed it. Out there in the dark, just past the glass, was a shape long, thin, and impossibly bent. It tilted its head, as if looking straight at me, eyes wide and gleaming in the moonlight. The nurse turned at the sound of my gasp, but the figure was already gone, leaving only a trail of red footprints leading into the night. It started as a simple afternoon at the park. My friends and I had planned to meet up, stretch out on the grass, and catch up. The park was a hidden gem, nestled between rows of towering apartment buildings, where the air was filled with the mingling sounds of laughter, bird calls, and the distant hum of traffic. The late summer sun was warm, and the trees around the edge of the park formed a canopy that dappled the ground with shifting shadows. We set up our picnic blanket under a large oak tree that, at its base, had a small hollow. We joked that it looked like the perfect place for a forest spirit to live, but none of us thought much about it. We were too busy talking and eating. It wasn't until the sun started dipping below the horizon, casting long, slanted rays across the grass, that the strange events began. A chill seeped into the air, as though a curtain had been pulled over the warmth of the day. We pulled our jackets closer and continued our conversation, unaware that the shadows under the trees had grown longer, moving in a way that was not natural. I stood up to stretch, looking out at the open field. The park was nearly empty now, save for a man in a dark coat sitting on the far bench. He seemed to be staring directly at us. I couldn't see his face, but there was something odd about the way he sat, stiff and unmoving. My friend Leah noticed him too and whispered, "Do you see that guy? He's been sitting there for ages." Before I could reply, the man stood up, and my breath caught in my throat. He started walking toward us, but his movements were jerky, like a marionette whose strings were tangled. My friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging looks of confusion. The park was quiet now, too quiet. The laughter of children had stopped, and the rustling of leaves was no longer soothing but tense. The man's figure grew larger as he came closer, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if he were looking at us through the corner of his eyes. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. We gathered our things and started walking toward the park exit, but the man followed. It was subtle at first, a slow shuffle, but when we picked up the pace, he did too. I glanced back and saw his face for the first time. It was pale, too pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to draw in the light around them. His mouth stretched into a grin that was not human, too wide, and filled with teeth that looked sharp and uneven. We reached the path that led to the main road, and I turned back for one last look. Then, without warning, he tilted his head back and let out a long, piercing screech that echoed through the park and made every hair on my body stand on end. We bolted for the exit, heart racing, feet pounding against the gravel path. Behind us, we could hear his footsteps, heavy and dragging. I dared to look over my shoulder once more and saw him standing there, not moving, his mouth still stretched in that same grotesque grin. We didn't stop running until we were out of the park and into the safety of the brightly lit streets. I turned around one last time, expecting to see him in the distance, but he was gone. The park was empty again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. Even now, months later, I still can't shake the memory. Every time I pass by that park, I feel that cold, unsettling stare, and I wonder if he's still waiting there, waiting for the next person to step into his path. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep, fiery orange when I arrived at my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed years ago, but I still visited their home to keep the place in good shape. My parents were out of town, and I thought it would be the perfect time to finish up some repairs and enjoy the peace and quiet of the country. The house was surrounded by fields of tall corn that creaked in the wind. The soft, rhythmic rustling made for a strange sort of comfort as I walked through the yard. But, as the night deepened, that comfort began to twist into something else, something cold. I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the sink when I heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic thud, as if something were tapping against the side of the house. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind against the wood. But then the thudding grew louder and more insistent, moving around the perimeter of the house. My heart skipped a beat as I turned off the tap and listened intently. The noise came from the back of the house, near the barn. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the counter, trying to steady my shaking hands. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating the yard in jagged strips of silver and black. I took a step outside, the air suddenly colder. The crickets had stopped singing, and the wind had died down to a whisper. It felt as if the world was holding its breath. I aimed the flashlight at the barn and froze. The door, which had always hung slightly ajar, was now wide open, creaking as it swayed gently in the breeze. And standing in the doorway was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then the figure moved, a tall, thin silhouette with long arms and a head that was too large for its body. It shifted, like it was trying to get a better look at me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a step back. The barn door creaked again, this time louder, as if something had stepped forward into the moonlight. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. It was then that I realized the figure was holding something. A long, curved blade that caught the light and reflected it in a way that made my skin prickle. It pointed the blade at me, then tilted its head, as if curious. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over a rock. My flashlight hit the ground and rolled, the beam sweeping over the cornfield that surrounded the property. The movement caught my attention. There were more of them, figures emerging from between the stalks. Tall, thin shapes, all with strange, twisted limbs and empty eyes that glowed a pale blue in the moonlight. My breath quickened. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight. The figure in the barn didn't move, but the others in the cornfield did, closing in around the house. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like lead. I aimed the beam of the flashlight at the nearest one, and it flinched back, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a low, wet growl. I bolted toward the front of the house, racing past the porch and slamming my hand against the door. It creaked open just as I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The old lock clicked into place, and I pressed my back against the wood, gasping for breath. The thudding returned, only now it was inside, pounding against the walls and floor like 100 feet shuffling over the old wood. I turned and grabbed a rusty old poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white as I gripped it. Then the whisper came, so soft I almost didn't hear it. A voice, as thin as the wind, whispering in the dark, "Not done. Not done." I spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of a pale face pressed against the window, eyes wide and glowing like the figures outside. It mouthed the same words, over and over, and that's when I realized, whatever these things were, they were waiting for me to step outside. They wanted me to leave, to join them under the moonlight. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the cold silence of the night. The house seemed to breathe around me, its ancient wood creaking in time with my heartbeat. I dared a glance outside and saw nothing but the moonlit corn, swaying gently in the wind, but I knew they were still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment I might open a door or step out of the safety of the house. And I knew I would never forget their eyes, those cold, empty eyes that glowed in the dark. The summer was in full swing when we decided to take a day trip out to the old reservoir, a place that had been closed off for years. It was a spot we'd grown up near, hearing stories about it but never daring to go there. I was with my cousins, a group of 4 of us in our late teens, all looking for some adventure away from the prying eyes of our small town. We drove along the dusty road, past fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of summer grass and something else I couldn't place, a sharp, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The reservoir itself was hidden behind a line of trees that had long since overgrown their bounds. As we pushed through, the sight of the water shocked me. It was dark and churning, like a bruise caught in the daylight. We spent hours splashing in the shallows, laughing, the water cool against the summer heat. The sun was dipping, casting long shadows across the banks when we noticed the change. The air seemed colder, the laughter from the kids echoing off the stillness of the trees. My cousin, Mia, who was always the brave one, suggested we venture further into the woods, away from the reservoir. We followed her, half joking that we were looking for the ghosts of those who drowned here long ago. The forest was thick, the branches like bony fingers reaching out to block our way. It was a strange quiet, one that felt deep and unnatural. The birds had stopped singing, and I could only hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and our heavy breathing. Then we heard it, a sound like a child's giggle, too close and too sharp to be real. We stopped dead in our tracks, eyes darting to each other. Nia tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked, and we knew she was just as scared as the rest of us. "Maybe it's someone else," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. We were miles from any other house, and nobody else had ventured this far into the woods in years. The giggle came again, louder this time, and we spun around. But there was nothing but darkness, the shadows stretching as if they were alive, searching. I was about to suggest we head back when I saw a glimmer by the edge of the trees, a figure, pale and small, standing just out of reach. It turned and moved into the underbrush. Fast, almost too fast for a person. "Who's there?" Mia called out, her voice a tremble now. There was no answer, just the sound of something scurrying through the trees. We backed away, the air thickening, pressing down on us like a weight. I felt my pulse in my temples, loud and relentless. We hurried back the way we came, the woods behind us seeming to watch and follow. Every now and then, we'd hear that laugh, now more like a shriek that cut through the silence, forcing us to run faster. When we made it back to the reservoir, we were breathless and trembling, the last rays of sunlight bleeding red on the water. We didn't say a word, not one of us daring to look back into the dark woods where that laugh still echoed. Fading into the night, Mia was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave now," she whispered. Her eyes were wide, and I realized that whatever we had heard wasn't human. We drove back in silence, the radio crackling with static that seemed to mimic that laugh. When I turned to look out the back window, I could swear I saw a small, pale hand waving from the edge of the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned what people whispered about that place. They said a child had drowned in the reservoir years ago, pulled under by something that nobody could explain. They said the child's laughter could still be heard, especially at sunset, as it tried to lure anyone close enough to join it in the dark, endless water. "I don't go near the reservoir anymore," not even in the light of day. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that laugh, soft and insistent, coming from the trees behind my house. I had never been a fan of driving long distances alone, but it was a rare chance to clear my head. My cousin's wedding was the next day, and I was determined to make it there. The route was scenic, winding through rolling hills and small towns that seemed frozen in time. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods with barely a sign of civilization. I pulled over when my phone buzzed, alerting me to a missed call. It was my cousin, reminding me of the directions and warning me that there would be no cell service in some areas. I laughed, thinking about how outdated that sounded, and tucked my phone away. That was the last sound I heard for a while. The road ahead curved into a darker part of the forest, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. As I drove, the headlights of my car bounced off the trunks, casting long, twisted shadows. I thought I saw movement up ahead, something darting just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just a rabbit or a deer. But then I saw it again, a tall figure that looked like it had been molded from bark and leaves, standing just out of reach of the light. It moved, jerking with an unnatural rigidity, almost like it had been caught mid-step. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as I stared into the dark. Nothing, just the forest and the dull thrum of my heartbeat. My hands were shaking as I started to drive again. The headlights barely cut through the twilight, and I swerved as I caught another glimpse of the figure, this time closer to the road. It was at the edge of my vision, a blur of movement. I didn't know if I should stop or keep going, but the road was empty behind me, and I couldn't risk turning around. Suddenly, my car's engine sputtered, and I watched in horror as the lights dimmed and then cut out altogether. The cabin of the car was plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the relentless thumping of my heart. I reached for my flashlight, feeling my palms turn cold as I fumbled to turn it on. A knock came from the driver's side window. My body froze, but my eyes went straight to the glass. A hand was pressed against it, long fingers reaching out with an unsettling rigidity. The skin looked rough, cracked, and speckled with dark patches. A face emerged, impossibly thin, with eyes that were wide and unblinking. It had a smile, but it was wrong. It was stretched too far, as though someone had pulled the corners of its mouth with hooks. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at the figure, but it was already retreating, melting back into the trees. The light illuminated the forest just long enough for me to catch sight of more figures. They emerged from the shadows like marionettes, limbs moving in angles they shouldn't, heads tilting back as if looking at something invisible. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. There was none. The figures started to close in, moving with a quick, unnatural shuffle. I unlocked the car door, my fingers trembling, and I stepped out into the gravel. The night air was sharp, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of branches snapping as the figures came closer. Then, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me as the vehicle pulled up, and a man stepped out, his face lit with concern. "Are you all right?" he called, glancing around nervously. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the figures, the terror clawing at my throat. The man followed my gaze and looked back at me with wide, horrified eyes. "They're already here," he whispered, and then he was running, disappearing into the forest. The figures paused, their heads turning in unison to follow him, and I realized with a sickening jolt that they were all heading in the same direction toward the road where I had just been. My car roared to life as if in response, and I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figures at the edge of the woods, watching. Their twisted faces held that same, stretched smile, and as they faded into the trees, I could almost hear them whispering a single word: "Run." It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I wanted to escape the city for a while. So, we decided to visit the old, abandoned amusement park just outside town. It had been closed for years, and rumors said it was haunted, but we didn't care. We were young, reckless, and looking for adventure. The park was a shell of its former self, with rusted rides and peeling paint. The Ferris wheel loomed over the grounds, its empty gondolas swaying slightly in the breeze. The air was heavy with the scent of old metal and something sour, almost like mildew. As we walked through the cracked entrance, a shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. We wandered from ride to ride, taking pictures and daring each other to step inside the old funhouse. Its glass was shattered, and the floor creaked beneath our weight as we stepped inside. The lights were long dead, but we each carried a flashlight, beams dancing across warped mirrors that distorted our reflections. "Did you hear that?" my friend, Marcus, whispered, and I strained my ears. It was faint but unmistakable laughter. High-pitched and childlike, like the giggle of a young girl. "Must be the wind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the laughter came again, clearer this time, coming from deeper inside the funhouse. I glanced at my friends. Sarah's face was pale, and Ben looked like he wanted to turn around and leave. "Let's just go," Ben muttered, eyes wide. But before anyone could move, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the halls of the funhouse, followed by a soft thumping sound, like small feet running across wood. Marcus took a shaky breath and pushed forward. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice faltered. We ventured further into the maze of warped mirrors and dark corners. I felt the back of my neck prickle as we reached the center of the funhouse. That's when I saw it, a small figure, standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged, flickering light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I saw. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9, with tangled hair and a dress that looked decades old. Her back was turned to us, but as we watched, she tilted her head to one side, as if she knew we were there. "Hey," Sarah called, voice quivering. "Are you okay?" The girl slowly turned, and my blood froze. Her eyes were black, empty pits that seemed to draw in all light, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. The air around us grew cold, and the flashlight went out. Marcus let out a strangled scream, and we all stumbled back, tripping over each other in a scramble to get out. The girl's laughter followed us, echoing and multiplying as if there were more of her. A chorus of voices overlapping and splitting in every direction. We ran, hearts pounding, pushing open the heavy doors of the funhouse. The laughter still rang in our ears as we sprinted across the park, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping for breath, tears streaming down our faces. When we looked back at the dark, silent amusement park, we saw the Ferris wheel. One of the gondolas was moving, slowly swinging back and forth, and then, from the top, a small face peeked out, eyes wide and empty, grinning down at us. We never went back. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a child's laughter, just beyond my window. The neighborhood had been eerily quiet that summer. The row of old houses at the end of the block, each one framed by overgrown hedges, were starting to look abandoned, despite the signs of life inside. I had moved into one of these old homes just a week ago, hoping the change of scenery would help me recover from a breakup and the stress of city life. The first few days were peaceful, but I soon learned that peace wasn't what I'd found. One evening, as the sky grew dark and the streetlights flickered on, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The old wooden gate to the next house creaked as I passed, and I glanced at the front porch, where a rocking chair sat motionless in the still air. I stopped, an inexplicable chill running down my spine. The porch light was off, but something felt wrong. I turned and kept walking, my mind wandering to work and the bills I had to pay. That's when I heard a soft tapping, almost like the sound of a branch against a window. I turned back, thinking perhaps someone was moving furniture or repairing something. But the porch was empty, the rocking chair unmoving. I shook it off and continued walking, crossing the road and heading down the path that led to the park. The park had been one of the main attractions of the neighborhood, with its old swing set, the crack slide, and the sand pit that had turned into a patch of dry, cracked earth. The swings were now swaying on their own, though there was no wind. A noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat as I stared into the darkening street. Nothing moved. There were no shadows flitting between the houses or glimpses of figures through the curtained windows. But then I heard it again, that light tapping, now coming from across the street. My pulse quickened. I took a hesitant step toward it. But before I could reach the porch of the nearest house, the tapping stopped. An uneasy silence settled over the neighborhood, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I rubbed my arms, willing the goosebumps to disappear. As I turned to head back home, the porch light of the abandoned house clicked on, casting a weak glow that made the shadows seem deeper. I paused, staring at the house. My feet felt rooted to the spot as I saw the silhouette of a person standing in the window, backlit and motionless. I squinted, trying to make out who or what it was. Just as my eyes adjusted, the figure raised an arm and waved. Slow and deliberate, my breath caught, and I backed away. The wind picked up suddenly, rushing past me with an unnatural force. The leaves of the old oak tree across the road rustled, and the branches creaked like old bones. The tapping returned, this time from inside the house, the sound like fingernails scraping across the floorboards. My gut told me to run, to get as far from that house as possible, but I was frozen. Before I could move, the front door creaked open, just a crack. A pale face peered out from the dark. It was a woman with wide, hollow eyes that seemed to look straight through me. Then she smiled, and the smile was too wide, far too wide for a human. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't obey. The woman stepped out, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The tapping grew louder, like someone was pounding a drum inside the house. The porch light flickered and died, plunging the street into darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my own front porch. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice before I managed to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me and bolted it, pressing my back against it as the wind howled outside. That night, as I lay in bed with the lights on and every door and window locked, I swore I heard the tapping again, this time coming from the back of the house, right where the old oak tree stood. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the knocking only grew louder, relentless, like a heartbeat echoing through the silence. And then a voice whispered from the darkness outside, "Let me in." It was an ordinary Saturday, and I decided to spend the day exploring the local flea market. It was sprawling and chaotic, filled with vendors selling everything from vintage clothing to antique furniture. I loved getting lost in the maze of tents and booths, weaving around people as I sifted through old trinkets and forgotten relics. Midway through the afternoon, I found myself drawn to a small, nondescript booth in the corner of the market. The man running it had an air of mystery, dressed in a tattered coat with eyes that flickered like candle flames whenever they caught the sunlight. The items on display were bizarre. Antique dolls with cracked porcelain faces, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, and small, delicate boxes with strange carvings. I was just about to leave when I spotted an old music box. It was ornately carved, with tiny dancers spinning in circles beneath a glass dome. I reached out, and as my fingers brushed it, the man's voice cut through the noise of the market. "Careful with that," he said, his tone sharp. "It's been known to attract attention." I froze, looking up at him. His smile was thin, almost predatory. "What kind of attention?" I asked, half joking. He leaned closer, eyes glinting with something unholy. "The kind you don't want." Before I could respond, a loud crash came from nearby, followed by the sound of panicked voices. I turned and saw a crowd gathering around a stall that had toppled over, scattering its contents across the pavement. My heart thudded with the sudden burst of chaos, and I shook my head, trying to ignore the man's words. I left the booth, music box still in hand, though it felt wrong, heavy in a way that didn't make sense. I wandered through the market, the noise and laughter suddenly grating on my nerves. The sun began to dip, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, and the air grew colder. Then, the music started. A soft, tinkling melody floated up from the music box I still held. It was a simple song, but it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I looked down at it, heart pounding, but the dancers remained frozen beneath the dome. The music should have stopped. The box wasn't wound up. I tried to put it down, but my fingers clamped tighter around it, as if someone else had control. I felt a cold breeze sweep through the market, stirring up paper cups and plastic bags. The voices of the crowd blurred into a low hum, as though muffled by a thick wall. And then I saw her, a girl in a faded, old-fashioned dress standing at the far end of the market. Her face was pale, with eyes like black holes that seemed to pierce right through me. She took a slow step forward, and the music box continued its haunting song. My pulse quickened, and I stumbled backward, bumping into someone behind me. I whirled around, but the market was empty, save for me and the girl who now stood only a few feet away. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that turned my breath to fog. I took another step back, but the girl's head tilted slightly, a cruel grin spreading across her face. A voice, thin and chilling, echoed inside my mind, "Play with me." The music box clattered to the pavement as I tried to run. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and my breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how hard I pushed, I couldn't move faster than the girl. Her eyes never left mine, and with every step, the air around us seemed to grow darker. I finally broke through the market and into the empty parking lot, where the late afternoon light was dim and dying. I couldn't see her anymore, but the song still played, winding through the parking lot like a thread pulling me back toward the chaos. I turned to grab the music box, but it was gone. I searched frantically, eyes darting over the cracked pavement. The song stopped suddenly, cutting off in a sharp note. Silence fell like a weight, and I swore I heard the faint sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the market was empty. The girl had vanished, and with her, the eerie melody that haunted me like a ghost. That was the last time I went back to that flea market, and the last time I ever heard a music box play. But I know it's still out there, waiting, because I can still hear the faint, haunting notes when the wind picks up at night. The road to the old farmhouse was long and winding, a forgotten path that cut through fields of tall grass and gnarled oaks. I had never been out to the farm before, but my friend Aaron had convinced me to join him on this trip to visit his grandparents. They were out of town, and he thought it would be fun to spend the weekend there, exploring and getting away from the city that had started out as a joke between us, a way to break up the monotony of our usual weekend routine. But as the sun sank below the horizon, the light slipping into dark shadows, an unease settled over me. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field, its old wooden panels darkened with age. Windows that had once been bright and inviting now cracked and dusty. We explored the house in the fading light, peering into rooms filled with old, rusting tools and faded photographs of a family that felt like a ghostly memory. I touched a picture frame that showed a woman and a man with a young child, their smiles warm and familiar. But it was the eyes that made me stop. They looked familiar, almost like they were staring back at me. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. Aaron laughed, his voice bouncing through the empty house. He was already upstairs, calling out for me to check out the attic. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I climbed up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, suffocating with the scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if someone else was up there with us. "Look at this," Aaron said, holding a dusty lantern aloft. The light flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stepped closer and saw an old, moth-eaten trunk. He opened it, and inside were old clothes, some toys, and a small diary with pages that looked like they could crumble with a single touch. I reached out and flipped it open, not expecting anything more than gibberish. But the words leapt off the page, written in a scrawled, frantic hand. "They come when the lights go out." They were the faces of those who were here before. The air around me grew colder, and I heard Aaron let out a sharp breath behind me. The lantern flickered again, and I spun around, the light catching his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open, but it wasn't just surprise that I saw. It was fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old house as if it were trying to break in. A low thud sounded below us, and then a muffled voice, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. My body tensed, and I felt a shiver race up my spine. "Aaron, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when I looked at him, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something that moved in the darkened corner of the attic. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The shadow moved, a shape that was impossible and familiar at once. A face. It had the same features as the one in the picture downstairs, But it wasn't a photograph anymore. It was real, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisting into a grin. I stumbled back, and the lantern fell from Aaron's hands, landing with a crash that shattered the glass and sent sparks skittering across the wooden floor. The room erupted into darkness, but I could still feel it moving closer, slow and deliberate. "Run!" Aaron shouted. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. The voice below grew louder, now unmistakable a child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before, followed by the soft sound of feet pattering on the floor above. We reached the front door, wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The moon was a pale slice in the sky, illuminating the fields that stretched out in front of us. We didn't stop to look back as we ran across the grass, the song still echoing behind us, chased by the sound of footsteps and a voice that whispered my name. When we reached the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The farmhouse loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless, but I saw something in the window on the second floor. A child's face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and hollow, watching us as we ran away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hearts pounding and breathless. I never told anyone what happened that night, and Aaron never spoke of it again. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that house, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard the voice. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. They come when the lights go out. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place. I watched as they danced around the fire. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. I have always loved the deep woods, the way the tall trees whisper secrets as the wind moves through them. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these woods and the visitors who came to enjoy them. It was mid-October when I received a call about a group of campers who hadn't checked in. I grabbed my gear and set out into the forest, ready to find them. The sun had set by the time I reached their designated campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tents were still pitched, but the area was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no sounds of rustling gear. I called out, hoping for a response, but silence met me. I stepped inside the nearest tent. Their sleeping bags were untouched, and the gear was scattered but still there. My heart raced as I realized something was wrong. I scanned the area, looking for signs of a struggle, but found nothing except a small trail leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The air grew heavier, the sounds of the forest fading into an eerie stillness. As I walked, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see a fellow ranger or the campers behind me, but I was alone. I pressed on, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. I heard a snap of a twig behind me and spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trail led me to a small clearing where the moonlight spilled onto the ground, illuminating what looked like a campsite. There was a fire pit, but it hadn't been used in a long time. I approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of life. That's when I saw a shape in the shadows near the tree line. I squinted, trying to make it out, and my heart stopped. It looked like a person, but something was off. The figure was hunched over, and as I stepped closer, I could see it was covered in dirt and leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I called out, trying to sound brave. "Hello. Are you okay?" The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by hair and grime. It opened its mouth to speak, but what came out was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure lunged forward, and I turned to run, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sprinted back toward the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I ran, branches whipped at my face, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could hear the figure crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. I had to reach the other rangers at the visitor center. They would know what to do. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor. I rolled over just in time to see the figure looming above me, its breath heavy and ragged. In a moment of sheer desperation, I reached for my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light caught its face, and I felt a jolt of horror as I recognized it. It was one of the campers, but not as I remembered. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was caked in mud and leaves. I stumbled back, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Where are the others?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The camper's expression shifted, a look of terror on his face. He pointed behind me, and as I turned, I froze. The rest of the campers stood at the edge of the clearing, but they were not alone. A group of twisted figures circled them, their bodies unnaturally contorted, faces hidden beneath matted hair. As the figures moved closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees, but it wasn't the joyous laughter of campers. It was taunting, sinister. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the truth. The campers were playing a game, a sick, twisted game in the dark, luring me in. The laughter crescendoed, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. But as I stood there, I remembered my training. I was a park ranger, not a victim. I turned and ran, this time not looking back. I burst through the tree line and onto the main path, gasping for air. I kept running until I reached the visitor center, where I collapsed against the door. Heart pounding, I told my fellow rangers everything, but they only stared at me, confusion in their eyes. I knew what I saw, but when we returned to the campsite, there was nothing. No campers, no signs of struggle, just an empty campsite in the moonlight. It was as if they had never existed at all. To this day, I still patrol those woods, and when the wind whispers through the trees, I hear their laughter echoing in the night. I know they are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to join their game. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and a few friends escaping the grind of everyday life. We'd picked a remote campsite tucked deep in a forest, miles away from civilization. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. We didn't want to risk being interrupted. The first day was perfect. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and the forest smelled of pine and earth. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent hours talking, laughing, and eating. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, the flames dancing, casting eerie shadows on the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant hoots of owls, but something felt off from them in the beginning. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off. There's nothing scarier than the woods at night. Right. That's just the way it goes. Around midnight, we decided to go for a short night hike. We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the forest. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting an otherworldly glow on everything. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. Our laughter died down, and the silence wrapped around us like a heavy cloak. As we walked deeper into the woods, I felt a strange sensation crawling up my spine. A feeling of being watched, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the night playing tricks on my mind. That's when we heard the first sound, a twig snapping behind us. We froze, the air thick with tension. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. One of my friends, Matt, chuckled nervously. "You're just paranoid," he said. Though his voice didn't sound entirely convinced, we kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. The forest seemed to be closing in on us. The shadows were longer now, stretching like fingers from the trees. The further we walked, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't natural. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had all gone quiet. Then, another snap. This time, it was closer. Much closer. We all turned in unison, scanning the trees with our flashlights. But again, nothing. "Okay, I'm starting to get freaked out," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We didn't go back immediately, but we sped up, our footsteps quickening as we tried to make our way back to camp. That's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic sound of something following us. Footsteps, but not like ours, too heavy, too deliberate. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Are we being followed?" I whispered, too afraid to speak louder. Matt shook his head, but his eyes were wide, scanning the trees. No way. We kept walking faster, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer, closer with every passing second. It was like whatever was behind us knew we were afraid. It was toying with us, making sure we knew it was there. Suddenly, there was a loud, deafening crash behind us, followed by a guttural growl, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. Panic surged. I could barely breathe. Matt's voice cracked as he yelled, "Run!" We sprinted back to camp, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The footsteps weren't behind us anymore. Now, They were in front of us, moving faster, closing in. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing where our campfire still burned, casting its flickering light across the campsite. We didn't stop. We didn't even look back. We dove into the tents, our hearts racing, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We lay there, frozen, listening. The sounds of the forest had returned. The crickets, the rustling leaves, the distant owl. But something was different. The wind shifted, and for a split second, I could smell something rancid like rot. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in the tents, wide awake, whispering in terrified voices. By morning, the tension had not lifted, but we packed up in silence. The drive back was equally unnerving. We didn't speak much, just glancing nervously at the woods as we passed. But the worst part, we didn't realize it until we got home. I checked my phone, and there was a picture. One I didn't take, a photo of us, standing in the woods, smiling. But there was someone else in the background, a shadowy figure, partially hidden behind a tree, its face obscured. And it wasn't until I zoomed in that I saw it. The figure was grinning. And it wasn't one of us. We never spoke about that weekend again. I've been a park ranger for over a decade, so I've seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness. But nothing compares to the night I had to work alone at one of the most remote parts of the park. It was an area that most tourists avoided, known for its dense forest, treacherous trails, and deep, unnerving silence. That night, the silence was the least of my concerns. It started like any other late shift. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the trees. I had a routine to follow: check the trail markers, make sure the paths were clear, and inspect the camping areas. Simple tasks, but there was something unsettling about that evening. The air felt thick, and as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the usual sounds of the forest birds calling, leaves rustling seemed to vanish. Around 9 p.m., I made my way to a section of the park where we'd received reports of unusual activity. A few campers had mentioned hearing footsteps and strange whispers late at night. I wasn't concerned. We'd gotten reports like that before, and they usually turned out to be animals or the wind. But something about that particular night made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were footprints on the trail, fresh ones. But they weren't human. They were too large to spread apart. I followed them for a few minutes, the crunch of my boots the only sound breaking the quiet. The footprints led me to a clearing near a creek. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. At first, I thought it was another ranger, someone I hadn't met before. "Hey, you lost?" I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. I took a few cautious steps forward, but something told me to stop. The air around me grew colder, and my breath began to fog up, though it wasn't that cold yet. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. It was something much deeper, more malevolent. My flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in my stomach. I called out again, this time more urgently, but no answer came. I had to get back to the station and report this. As I turned to leave the clearing, I noticed the footprints again, but they weren't where they had been. They were closer now, directly in front of me. The space between each step seemed to grow smaller. That's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't in any language I knew. It sounded like it was right behind me. But when I spun around, there was nothing. Just the forest, empty and still. I hurried back down the trail, keeping an eye on the path behind me. My heart was racing. The whispering continued, but now it sounded like it was coming from all directions, closing in on me. I stumbled, trying to maintain my composure, but the whispers grew louder. Then, the figure appeared again, this time in the middle of the trail. I froze. It wasn't just standing there now, it was moving toward me. Slowly, its limbs impossibly long. As it got closer, the air grew colder still, and my breath became more labored. The figure's face was still obscured, but its presence felt wrong. My body was telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The whispering stopped. In the stillness, I could hear something else now, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on bark. The sound came from the figure, and it was getting louder, faster, as if it were moving toward me at an accelerating pace. I snapped into motion. My legs finally worked, and I sprinted down the trail, not daring to look back. The tapping continued behind me, but I didn't dare stop or slow down. It wasn't until I reached the ranger station and locked myself inside that I dared to catch my breath. I spent the rest of the night in a panic, eyes darting to every shadow, every creak of the building. The next morning, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the figure. There were no footprints, nothing had been disturbed. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. On the bark of a nearby tree, carved into the wood, were words scratched in with the sharp object, "I'm still here. I didn't sleep that night. And I've never gone back to that part of the park alone." It started as a simple weekend getaway with a few friends. We had all been craving a break from the city. So, we decided to camp deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. No one had been there before, but the spot looked perfect on the map, secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by towering pines. We were ready for adventure. We arrived around noon, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. Setting up camp took only a couple of hours, and by the time the sun began to set, the campfire crackled between us, casting long shadows on the ground. We joked around, ate, and made plans for a short hike the next morning. The air was crisp, and everything felt normal. Then, as night fell, the forest seemed to change. The wind picked up, and the trees began to groan. It wasn't a particularly unsettling sound, but it felt wrong, somehow, like the wind was trying to say something. I brushed it off, attributing it to the wilderness being what it is, alive, unpredictable. We huddled closer to the fire as it burned low, the darkness pressing in around us. It wasn't until the first strange sound that I started to feel uneasy. A loud crack, like something heavy snapping, echoed from the tree line. It wasn't a branch falling. It was too forceful, too deliberate. We all went silent, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There were no animals in the area that sounded like that, at least none we knew of. Probably just a deer, someone suggested, though none of us believed it. A second crack followed, closer this time. We stayed quiet, listening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was out there. "Maybe we should go to bed," I said, trying to sound calm. "We'll hike in the morning." But no one moved. Everyone stayed stiff, eyes darting around, clearly unsettled. We decided to put out the fire early and retire to our tents, though none of us were eager to sleep. The wind howled through the trees, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sounds outside grew louder, more persistent. The scratching against the tent fabric started softly, like wind brushing over it, but then it intensified. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like something or someone was pressing against the side of the tent. I sat up, heart racing. I wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the thought of an animal or the idea that someone was out there. I didn't want to check, but the scratching grew louder, more urgent. Finally, I couldn't take it. I unzipped the tent slowly, holding my breath. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees, shadows, and the twisted shapes of branches, but the scratching didn't stop. It continued, as if whatever was outside the tent was toying with me. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Don't look." My blood ran cold. I slammed the tent shut and laid down again, trying to calm my frantic heart. The whisper repeated, louder this time, "Don't look." I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was happening. The whisper sounded close, too close, like someone was standing right next to my tent. But when I dared to peek outside again, there was nothing. I wasn't the only one who had heard it. When I glanced over at the others, I saw they were awake, staring at me with wide eyes. No one spoke, but we all understood. Something was wrong. We decided to leave, pack up, and get out of there. As we gathered our things in the dark, the whispers returned, echoing through the trees. But this time, there was something more. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching us from the tree line. I grabbed my pack and ran toward the path, my friends following behind me. We didn't stop until we reached the car. As we pulled out of the clearing and back onto the road, the whispers followed us, growing fainter as we drove farther away. It wasn't until we were nearly an hour away from the campsite that I glanced at my phone and noticed something strange. Several photos on my camera roll, taken during the night. I didn't recognize them. They were blurry, distorted, but one stood out, a picture of our campfire, with a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't one of us. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, there were no eyes, just black sockets staring back. The worst part, the photo had been taken at the exact moment we'd heard the whisper, "Don't look." We'd survived the night, but whatever had been watching us, it was still there, waiting. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a simple hike with a couple of friends. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, a place where we could escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. It wasn't even supposed to be an overnight trip, but that night changed everything. We started out in the late afternoon, taking a trail that had been described to us as off the beaten path by some locals. It was supposed to be an easy trek, just a few hours to a nice, quiet clearing by a stream where we could set up camp and spend the evening. The air was crisp, the sky still clear, and everything felt perfect, at least for the first couple of hours. As we made our way deeper into the woods, we noticed something strange. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I assumed it was just the stillness of the forest, but the longer we walked, the more unnerving it became. Even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made your skin tingle and your senses go on high alert, as though something was watching you. We set up camp around dusk. A small fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, and we sat around it, trying to shake off the growing unease. We didn't talk much, which felt odd for a group of friends who usually couldn't stop chatting. The quiet was heavy. Then we heard it, a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. Help? It came from somewhere beyond the trees, just barely audible. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind, but it was too clear, too real. We all froze. I looked around at my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. They were just as unnerved as I was. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," one of them replied. "What the hell was that?" We all stood up, eyes darting around the campfire, trying to make sense of it. The voice came again, this time louder. "Help me." The words were desperate, frantic, almost pleading. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the source of the sound. I don't know why we didn't stop. It didn't make sense. It was dark, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded wrong, almost like it was coming from something not human. But we went anyway. The woods around us grew darker the deeper we went, the trees closing in. The air became thick, the chill biting at our skin. We followed the voice for what felt like an eternity, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was as if we were chasing a ghost, the sound shifting and moving, just out of reach. Then, we found it. A small clearing, barely big enough for all of us to stand in. At the center of it was a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks was a crude carving, a symbol I didn't recognize, something old and unsettling. The voice stopped. We all stood there, staring at the rocks, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. Then, we heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the distance. It was right behind us. "Help me." The voice was now right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath against my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. My friends were in the same state of panic, spinning in circles, their flashlights flickering wildly. We didn't know what to do. Every instinct told us to run, but the path back was already obscured by the shadows. That's when I noticed it, a shadow. A figure, standing just outside the circle of our lights, barely visible but unmistakable. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. The others shouted for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a black silhouette. No distinct features, just an outline that seemed to shift with the light. And then, it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help. "Leave." The voice was deep and unnatural, reverberating in my chest like a thunderclap. My friends screamed and pulled me back, dragging me away from the figure. We stumbled back through the trees, terrified and confused, not daring to look behind us. The forest seemed to open up before us, like the path had been waiting. When we made it back to the clearing where we had set up camp, the fire was out. The tents were gone, completely vanished. Everything was still, but not in the same way as before. It was a stillness that felt empty, like the forest had swallowed us whole and left nothing but the echo of our fear. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what we saw, or who or what had been calling us. But there's one thing I know for sure. The figure wasn't the thing we were supposed to fear. It wasn't the thing that wanted us to leave. It was the thing that wanted us to stay. It began on a cold, damp evening when my cousin invited me to help clean out the attic of his late grandfather's house. The old house had been empty for months, sitting untouched on a lonely hill surrounded by dense woods. He had asked me to come along because the place gave him the creeps, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. The house was ancient, its wooden frame groaning in protest every time the wind shifted. The attic was the worst. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. It was crammed with boxes, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and old mirrors leaning precariously against the walls. A single, naked bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows. It was the kind of place that made your skin crawl for no good reason. That, as we worked through the clutter, sorting what to keep and what to toss, I couldn't help but feel like the shadows were moving. Every time I glanced at the mirrors, I thought I caught something out of place. Not me, not my cousin, but something else. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But the feeling wouldn't go away. We worked until the sun set, and darkness filled the attic. The bulb cast a sickly yellow light, barely illuminating the room. My cousin, sorting through an old trunk, suddenly froze and held something up. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle. He opened it, and the brittle pages crumbled slightly at the edges. It was filled with spidery handwriting, most of it illegible except for one phrase, which repeated over and over. "Don't let it in." My cousin laughed nervously, brushing it off as a weird quirk of an old man with too much time on his hands. But the air felt heavier after that, as if the room itself were holding its breath. We tried to shake it off and keep working, but the unease only grew. I felt like we were being watched. Every so often, I'd turn to look at the mirrors, and I could have sworn there was something wrong with our reflections. The movements weren't quite right, like a half-second delay. I said nothing, afraid of sounding paranoid. But then my cousin spoke up, his voice trembling. He asked if I'd noticed something strange. Before I could answer, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the sound of my breathing loud in the silence. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the rows of mirrors. That's when I saw it. In one of the mirrors near the back of the attic, there was a third reflection. It wasn't me, and it wasn't my cousin. It was taller, hunched, with impossibly long arms and a face that looked almost human but not quite right. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My cousin gasped. He saw it too. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, only the cluttered attic and the oppressive darkness. My hands shook as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer. It was staring directly at me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I grabbed my cousin's arm, my voice barely a whisper. We needed to leave, now. He nodded, and we stumbled down the narrow stairs, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. As we reached the hallway, we heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the attic. We didn't stop to investigate, we ran. The house seemed to twist and stretch around us, the walls closing in as we stumbled toward the front door. The scraping sound grew louder, faster, chasing us. Just as we reached the door, I turned back, unable to help myself. At the top of the stairs, it stood, the same figure from the mirror, hunched and grinning, its eyes fixed on us. But what made my blood run cold was the realization that it wasn't just standing there, it was holding the journal. The phrase "don't let it in" was scrawled across its body, etched into its skin like deep, angry scars. We burst out into the night, slamming the door behind us. The sound of the scraping stopped. The house loomed behind us, silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching us leave. We didn't speak as we drove away, too shaken to process what had happened. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what we saw or how it was possible. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself avoiding mirrors, and every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see that twisted grin staring back at me. I never believed in things I couldn't explain. I'd laugh off ghost stories, chalking up strange sounds and eerie feelings to the mind's ability to imagine the worst. But that weekend changed everything. A group of friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains. The type of cabin you see in those old horror movies, isolated, surrounded by trees, with nothing but silence for miles. I was a little uneasy at first, but I shrugged it off. I'd heard the stories. Sure. But this was just a weekend away. What could go wrong? The first night was normal enough. We had dinner, played cards, and laughed around the fireplace. The night was calm, almost too calm. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from the fire and the soft howls of wind outside. We were about to call it a night when we heard a soft knock on the door. It was so light, I thought maybe I imagined it. But then it came again, more insistent. My friend Mark, being the curious one, went to answer it. He swung the door open, but no one was there. We all laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark closed the door and locked it, but I noticed the way his hands trembled as he did. We headed to our rooms and tried to sleep. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, the same knock. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't the only one. One by one, I heard whispers coming from the other rooms. Everyone had heard it. Mark tried to convince us it was just the wind, but I knew better. This wasn't wind. This was something at the door. We tried to laugh it off, but none of us could sleep. Every little creak, every gust of wind, felt like it was right on top of us. Eventually, around 2 a.m., the knocking stopped, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, we decided to leave early. There was no way we were staying another night. As we packed up, I noticed something strange. The doorknob was cold, unnaturally cold. I reached out to touch it, and it felt as if it had been exposed to ice for hours. I shook it off and went back inside to grab my things. That's when I saw there was a dark smear on the door frame. Not dirt, it looked more like a handprint, but the fingers were too long, the shape too unnatural. I felt a chill run down my spine. We rushed out of there, eager to put the place behind us. But the moment we left the cabin and got into the car, I saw something in the rearview mirror, a face. A pale, gaunt face, staring at us from the window. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't tell the others. They had enough to worry about, and I wasn't sure if I had just imagined it. As we drove down the mountain, I felt uneasy, like we were being watched. When we finally reached the highway and I thought we were safe, we pulled over to grab a coffee at a small, run-down diner. While waiting in line, I overheard a conversation between two locals. One of them was telling the other about a missing family, a family who had rented a cabin up in those very mountains over a decade ago. They were never found. The authorities speculated they had simply vanished, but one of the officers had written something strange in his notes. The knocking didn't stop. It kept coming, even after they were gone. I froze. I turned to glance out the diner window, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. That's when I realized, just as we had packed up to leave, the knocking had stopped. But it hadn't stopped for us. It had stopped for them. We were the ones who were supposed to stay. We never planned on staying at the old inn. It was a last-minute decision, one of those spontaneous trips where you just pick a place and go. My friends and I had rented a cabin a few hours away from the city, hoping for a weekend of peace and fun. When we arrived, though, the place felt wrong. There was something about it, like a faint, suffocating presence in the air that made my skin prickle. The inn looked fine at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, everything changed. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. We checked in with the manager, a pale woman with hollow eyes who barely looked up from her desk. She handed us a key and muttered something about the inn being under renovation, but her words barely registered. It wasn't until we reached our room that the unease settled in. The door groaned as we opened it, revealing an oddly furnished space with peeling wallpaper and a single window covered by heavy curtains. It felt like time had stopped there. The air was stifling, thick with something that made me uneasy. That night, we decided to explore the inn. It was late, but curiosity got the best of us. We wandered through the long hallways, the wooden floorboards echoing under our footsteps. The place was eerily quiet, no sounds of other guests, no laughter, no voices, just silence, broken by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then, we heard it. A soft, slow tapping, like fingernails against wood. The sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't ignore it. The tapping came again, this time closer, and a shiver ran down my spine. We reached a door at the end of the hall, one that looked different from the others. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had forgotten to close it all the way. We pushed it open cautiously. Inside, the room was dark, but there was an old-fashioned mirror on the wall, one of those large, full-length ones. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There was a figure in the reflection, standing just behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. I felt a chill run through me, and my friends laughed, thinking it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned away quickly, but the tapping sound came again, this time much louder, right outside the door. It was fast now, frantic, like something was desperate to get in. We all rushed out of the room, our nerves on edge. The hall was empty, but the atmosphere had changed. It felt colder, the silence heavier. We walked back toward our room, the tapping following us, echoing down the corridor. My heart raced as we reached our door. The key wouldn't fit into the lock, no matter how many times I tried. It was as if the door itself didn't want us inside. Finally, I pushed the door open with force, and we rushed inside, locking it behind us. But the tapping continued, now accompanied by a faint, whispering voice. It was too faint to understand, but it was there scraping at the edges of my mind. I sat on the bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, just a product of the late hour and a creepy atmosphere. But then the room grew unnaturally cold. I looked at the mirror across from me. The reflection was different now. It wasn't me standing there, it was someone else. A figure in tattered clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but their eyes were glowing, watching me. The tapping stopped. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Let me out," it whispered. I jumped back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the door to our room creaked open, slowly, on its own. I rushed to shut it, but the door didn't move. It was stuck, like something was holding it from the other side. In the reflection, I saw the figure step toward the door. And then it spoke again, louder now, as if it was right beside me. "You shouldn't have stayed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the force of it rattling the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to my friends, but they were all staring at the mirror, wide-eyed, as though they were seeing the same thing I was. That's when I understood. The inn wasn't just old, it was a trap. The figure, the whispers, the tapping, it was all part of it. Something wanted us to stay, to never leave. We packed up and left the next morning, the sun barely rising, the inn still silent. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The inn was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Just empty space, surrounded by trees. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in that inn didn't want us to leave. And it might be waiting for the next people who wander too close. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify, but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. We had been planning this camping trip for months. There were 5 of us, me, my brother, and 3 close friends. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp, cool air that made you feel alive. We were excited, naive even, about what awaited us deep in the woods. There were no trails, no paths, just an untouched part of the forest, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside time. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening sharing stories, laughing, and watching the sky darken. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, distant owl calls, and the occasional snap of twigs under the weight of unseen creatures. At first, it was all part of the adventure, but as the night deepened, a strange unease began to settle over us. We joked about it, but something in the air felt different. There was a presence, something just beyond the firelight. Around midnight, we heard it, A soft scratching noise, just outside the perimeter of the fire. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal we knew. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. One of us joked that it was a bear or a raccoon, but even as we laughed, the scratching continued. And then, it stopped. Silence. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Our laughter died in our throats as the air grew heavier. Another sound. This time, it was a low thud, like something large had fallen nearby. It was followed by an eerie, unnatural silence. Our eyes darted toward the edge of the firelight, the trees just beyond the reach of our flame. The night felt to still. I stood up, wanting to reassure everyone. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was hammering. The others hesitated, but none of them wanted to be the ones to sit alone by the fire. They followed me as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped beyond the circle of warmth. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. "It's nothing," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else, but something gnawed at me. I scanned the area, moving the flashlight back and forth, when I noticed something strange. A few feet away, just under a tree, a pile of leaves had been disturbed. But the odd thing wasn't the pile, it was the shape beneath it. It looked wrong. The pile wasn't natural, it was too neat, too perfect. Almost like a body. I froze. Then I heard it, a soft, shallow breath, too close, too real. It came from just behind me. I whipped around, my heart skipping a beat. But there was nothing but darkness. "What is it?" My brother's voice trembled behind me. The others stood just out of the flashlight's reach, their faces pale in the dark. "Stay here," I whispered, taking a step forward toward the strange pile. The flashlight's beam quivered in my hand as I moved closer, my feet crunching on the dry leaves. I reached down to move the leaves, and then I saw it. A hand, pale, twisted, and partially buried. The hand of something human. No, the fingers were too long, too thin, the nails sharp and yellow. I jerked back, but as I did, something in the trees above moved. My eyes shot upward, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard the voice. It was faint at first, but growing clearer. A whisper. "Help? Me, please." I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. I knew something was behind me. I could feel it. I turned, and there it was, a face, not far off. It was pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too wide, too empty. The mouth stretched into a twisted grin that was more of a sneer, the skin hanging loosely, as if it had been drained of life. It didn't belong there. It didn't move like anything I had ever seen. It was too still, too unnatural. I screamed. The others bolted into motion, running, but the thing's gaze never left me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow and quick. I almost tripped over my own feet as I turned and sprinted toward the fire. But the thing it followed us. We made it back to the fire pit, gasping for breath, the flames casting frantic shadows in every direction. But, as we huddled there, the scratching started again. This time, it was closer. The leaves on the ground shifted. Slowly, almost casually, the thing stepped out from the shadows, its feet barely touching the earth. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. We all stared at it, waiting for the next move, but it didn't make another sound. That's when the real horror struck. We realized it wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure, crouched low to the ground, stepping into view. Then another, and another, all of them pale, gaunt, their eyes wide and empty. They didn't move, they just stood there in the darkness, staring at us. It wasn't just one thing, there were dozens of them. And then, just as quickly, they were gone. No movement, no sound. Only the rustling of leaves in the distance. Just a few friends in the woods for some camping, hiking, and stargazing. Nothing out of the ordinary. But by the end of that trip, I'll never look at the woods the same way again. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the kind of perfect weather where the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. We set up camp near a quiet stream, the sound of running water soothing against the chirps of crickets. There were 4 of us, all in our mid-20s. Sarah, Jason, Mark, and me. We were all excited, talking and laughing while we unpacked. As evening rolled in, we started a fire, the orange glow flickering against the growing darkness. Sarah had brought a deck of cards. So, we began playing a game, while Mark roasted marshmallows. The forest around us felt peaceful, serene, and we had no reason to think anything would go wrong. That's when the first thing happened. It started with a strange noise. A rustling, like something heavy brushing against the trees. We paused mid-laugh, listening. It was coming from behind us, deeper into the woods. Probably just an animal, Jason said, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But then the noise came again. This time, it was closer. I stood up, a little on edge. Do you think it's a bear? We're fine? Mark said, waving it off. Bears are usually scared of people. I didn't feel reassured. But as Sarah and Jason continued their card game, I forced myself to sit back down. The noise stopped as abruptly as it started. Night came quickly, and with it, a bone-chilling cold. We huddled around the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows in every direction. That's when I noticed something odd. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight, there was movement. Figures, dark, vague shapes that shifted between the trees. Did you see that? I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Sarah didn't even look up. Probably deer, she said dismissively. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, expecting to see something or someone moving just out of view. At some point, we all went to bed. Our tents pitched just far enough apart that we had privacy, but still close enough to hear each other. The wind picked up in the night, whistling through the trees, making every creak and groan of the forest feel like something was creeping closer. I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, that rustling sound. This time, it was unmistakable, the heavy movement of something large and deliberate. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed right outside. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay still. Suddenly, there was a sharp scratching at the side of my tent. My breath caught in my throat. It was deliberate, slow, like something with claws was testing the fabric. I wanted to scream, to yell for my friends, but I couldn't. I didn't dare move. The scratching stopped, and then the worst part came, a voice soft and chilling, like it was right next to my ear. It whispered my name. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer, not even a breath. I held my breath, listening for any further sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, without warning, the tent flap whipped open, sending a blast of cold air inside. I screamed. It was Mark, his eyes wide and panicked, his face pale. Get out of the tent. We didn't question him. We scrambled out, half-dressed, into the cold night air. The fire was out, and the woods around us felt unnaturally silent. Jason, always the skeptic, muttered, "What the hell's going on? Man, I swear to God," Mark said, shaking. I saw something outside. It wasn't human. We huddled together, staring into the dark, waiting for some sign of what Mark had seen. That's when we heard it again, the rustling, the snapping of twigs, the whispering voice. This time clearer. It was coming from all around us. That's when Sarah gasped. She pointed to the trees. There, in the distance, just past the tree line, were dozens of pale faces staring back at us. Their eyes were wide, their mouths hanging open, frozen in a strange expression of fear or pain. They weren't human. They were something else. I don't remember how we made it back to the car. All I know is that when we finally pulled out of that forest, we didn't look back. Not once. It wasn't until we were home that I realized something disturbing. That night, when we were huddling by the fire, I had noticed something strange on Sarah's hand. A small mark, almost like a scratch. It was gone the next day, as if it had never been there at all. But when I looked at her hand again later, when we were all back in the safety of our homes, the mark was back, a long, thin line, like a scratch from a claw, only this time, it was moving. The camping trip started as a way to escape the chaos of city life. My friends and I set off into the wilderness, our spirits high and supplies packed. We found a secluded spot near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Yena had brought a deck of cards, and we played games until the stars blanketed the sky. Once the games faded into silence, Matt suggested a night hike. Yena looked hesitant, but was quickly swept up in the excitement. I had always loved the woods, so I was all in. As we made our way down a narrow path, the moonlight filtered through the trees, creating an ethereal glow. The air was crisp, and the sounds of nature surrounded us. But then we heard something, a faint rustling, that made me stop in my tracks. I brushed it off as the wind and continued walking, though an unsettling feeling settled in my stomach. We pressed on, deeper into the woods, but the sense of unease lingered. Just when I thought we'd enjoy a peaceful walk, a loud snap echoed in the stillness. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound was too close for comfort. Gina's eyes widened, and she whispered that we should go back. But before we could turn around, we caught sight of something moving in the distance. A figure was partially illuminated by the moonlight, standing still among the trees. It looked human, but was too far away to see clearly. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. But the moment I did, the figure suddenly darted behind a tree. It was quick and too agile for comfort. My instincts screamed to get back to camp, but curiosity got the better of me. I urged my friends to follow, and we moved cautiously toward the area where we'd seen the figure. As we got closer, the air felt heavier, almost electric. I shone my flashlight around, but the woods seemed to swallow the light. The figure was gone. My friends exchanged nervous glances, and the laughter we shared earlier faded into a tense silence. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent chills up my spine. "Help me." We froze, hearts pounding, searching for the source of the voice. It sounded desperate and distant, echoing through the trees. Yena gripped my arm tightly, and we all turned in unison toward the sound, which seemed to draw us deeper into the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. "Help me." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I led the group further into the darkness, following the voice that begged for help. As we walked, the whispering intensified, morphing into frantic cries. The air grew colder, and shadows danced menacingly around us. Suddenly, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit old cabin, the kind you only see in horror movies. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. The cries for help echoed from inside, now sounding almost pleading. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't turn back. We had to see what was going on. We approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking under our feet as we stepped inside. The air was stale, and the smell of decay filled the space. The cries for help were now frantic, almost desperate. I felt a pull, as if something was urging me to go deeper into the cabin. My friends hung back, uncertainty etched on their faces. Then, as I turned to look into one of the dark rooms, the door slammed shut behind me. My heart raced, and I whirled around, panic rising. The cries turned into laughter, echoing around me. It was a sinister, mocking sound that sent waves of dread through my body. I pounded on the door, yelling for my friends. The door creaked open, and I stumbled back into the clearing, breathless. My friends stood there, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't heard any cries. They hadn't heard anything. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the area. I felt my stomach drop as realization hit. We had followed a voice that wasn't there, led into a trap we could barely comprehend. We turned to run back to camp, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. We didn't stop until we reached the lake. The moonlight illuminated our campsite, and the fire still flickered weakly. But when we arrived, we froze in horror. Our gear was scattered, the tent torn apart. In the center of the camp was a message carved into the ground with something dark and sticky. "Thanks for playing." Panic set in, and we grabbed what we could. We didn't speak, didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw was the cabin, standing silent and foreboding, the laughter echoing in my mind. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes I still hear the whispers, drawing me back to the woods. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent, near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and packed my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, the laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. The night had settled in the forest like a heavy blanket, and as a park ranger, I was used to the eerie calm that enveloped the woods after sunset. The campgrounds were closed for the season, but I had to make my rounds to ensure no one had sneaked in for an illicit camping trip. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted branches and underbrush. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual: a tent set up deep in the woods, far from the designated camping area. My heart raced. The site was supposed to be closed for the season, and no one should be there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As I got closer, I could see the tent was unzipped but empty. The campfire pit lay cold and dark, a few charred logs scattered around. I scanned the area, calling out if anyone was there, but only the wind answered. I was about to turn back when I noticed a backpack near the tent, half open, and inside, I caught a glimpse of a child's drawing. It was crude but depicted a family camping. My gut twisted. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence: laughter, distant yet unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childish. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Children shouldn't be out here alone, especially in the dead of night. I made my way toward the sound, heart pounding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling stillness. Then, I heard something else, a low growl. Unlike anything I had heard before, it sent a bolt of fear through me. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to see beyond the trees, but nothing moved. I hesitated, trying to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just an animal. With a deep breath, I continued, hoping to find the children and bring them back to safety. I stumbled into a small clearing and spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, among the foliage, stood a tall figure, its back turned to me. It wore what appeared to be a tattered, oversized sweater, the hem dragging along the ground. I called out, but it didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if sensing my presence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a chill swept over me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly turned around. My flashlight flickered against its face, a twisted, unsettling mask that was neither human nor animal. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and it opened its mouth to let out a haunting sound that mimicked laughter. The growl I heard earlier grew louder, but I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, heart racing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes. I sprinted back toward the path, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. As I emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath, I nearly collided with a family of 3 parents and a young child, their eyes wide with confusion. They must have arrived just as I was fleeing. I hurriedly explained what I had seen, the laughter, the figure. They listened, faces pale and frightened, but before I could convince them to leave, the laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure emerged from the tree line behind them. I shouted for them to run, and they turned in terror. The family sprinted down the path as I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for backup. I didn't look back until I reached the main ranger station, heart pounding. When the other rangers arrived, we formed a search party, but the woods were silent. We combed the area, but there was no sign of the figure, the tent, or the family I had seen. Hours passed with no trace, and as dawn broke, the sun illuminated the woods with a haunting beauty. Later, as we gathered to regroup, I heard the same high-pitched laughter wafting through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I turned to my fellow rangers, trying to shake off the growing dread. As we discussed the plan, I caught a glimpse of the child from the family I had encountered earlier, standing at the edge of the woods, a grin on his face. But it wasn't just any grin. It was the same twisted smile I had seen on the figure. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The child wasn't lost. He was part of whatever was lurking in the woods, and now they had returned, watching, waiting. I had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The laughter echoed again, and I felt the woods close in around me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I, Rachel, Tom, and Jake, had been planning our camping trip for weeks. We chose a remote site deep in the woods, far away from city lights and noise, promising ourselves a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The air was crisp when we arrived, the sun shining bright overhead as we set up our tents by a small, glimmering lake. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and a little unnerving. After a while, Rachel suggested we play a game of truth or dare, which seemed harmless enough. We laughed, teased each other, and drank a few beers while the fire crackled. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest and muffling the sounds of the night. The laughter died down, and a strange quiet settled over us, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. Hey, did anyone else feel that? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Feel what? He said. The thrill of camping. Come on, were fine. We decided to head to our tents for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Suddenly, I heard something else, a faint whispering that seemed to float through the air. I sat up, straining to listen. The voices were indistinct, but they felt close, too close. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Rachel," I whispered, not wanting to alarm her. "Do you hear that?" She groaned and pulled the sleeping bag over her head. "Hear what? Just go to sleep." But I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt compelled to get out of my tent. I unzipped it quietly and stepped out, the cool air hitting my skin. The fog was thick, swirling around me, and the fire had died down to embers, casting dim, flickering shadows. I turned toward the woods where the whispers seemed to come from. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently. I felt drawn to them, as if the whispers were calling my name. Just as I took a step forward, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to find Jake standing there, looking equally bewildered. "Did you hear it too?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," I replied, glancing back toward the trees. "It's coming from over there." We stood there for a moment, caught between curiosity and dread. When Tom and Rachel emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" Tom asked, rubbing his eyes. "We heard voices," I explained, and as I did, the whispers intensified, almost as if they were responding to us. The four of us stood together, the fear palpable in the air. Suddenly, as if on cue, the whispers faded, and a silence fell over the woods. We looked at each other, our breaths visible in the chilly night air. "Let's get back to the fire," Rachel said, her voice shaky. We hurried back, relieved to be in the warmth of the remaining embers. As we sat together, the tension slowly eased, though we couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us that night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we all crawled back into our tents, vowing to leave early in the morning. When dawn broke, we packed up quickly, eager to escape the strange occurrences of the night before. We drove home with a sense of relief, but deep down, I knew the forest held secrets I would never understand. To this day, I wonder what those whispers meant and if they were meant for us at all. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, a weekend getaway to disconnect, to get away from the noise and distractions of the world. Me and my 3 friends Jake, Ellie, and Tom had spent days picking the perfect spot in the woods, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd be completely cut off if anything went wrong. We arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sun dipped behind the trees as we worked, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, idyllic even. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling stories. It was the kind of atmosphere where you felt safe, surrounded by friends and the flickering warmth of the fire. But then things began to feel off. It started with Ellie. She was sitting closest to the tree line, her back to the forest, when she suddenly froze. At first, we thought she was just being dramatic, messing around like she always did. But then she looked at us, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard something," she said, her voice shaky. We all stopped talking, listening intently. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Jake stood up, shaking his head. "Ellie, there's nothing out there. It's just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak yourself out." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She insisted she heard something movement, like footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We all stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves she was just letting her imagination run wild. But, as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift more than usual, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching us. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, and the night seemed to stretch on much longer than it should have. At some point, we decided to head to our tents. We doused the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the night. We settled into our sleeping bags, but none of us could sleep. The sounds of the forest had taken on a strange quality, like they were distorted, just out of sync. Every rustle in the brush, Every snap of a twig felt amplified, as though the woods themselves were breathing. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang, like something large crashing into a tree. It was so sudden, so sharp, that we all jolted upright in our tents. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tom was the first to grab a flashlight. He crawled out of his tent cautiously, shining the beam toward the woods. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, empty trees. But then the beam caught something, a figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. A person? No, not quite. The figure was too still, too unnaturally rigid. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in our direction. We froze. None of us dared to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It just watched. Who the hell is that? Jake hissed, barely above a whisper. We had no idea. We hadn't seen anyone else on the hike-in. No campers, no sign of anyone else around. But there it was, standing like a mannequin in the trees, its head slightly tilted, its limbs unnaturally straight. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was about to call the ranger station when the figure moved. Slowly, it turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Get inside the tents now, I yelled, grabbing Ellie by the arm and pulling her toward her tent. We scrambled, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The flashlight had flickered out, casting the camp back into darkness. We could hear the figure moving closer, the rustling of branches, the slow scrape of something dragging across the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud thud like a body hitting the ground. Then silence. We waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move, our minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But after a long while, we heard footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. One by one, we mustered the courage to step outside, the fear still heavy in our chests. When we checked the area where the figure had stood, we found something strange. It wasn't human at all. It was a mannequin, but not a normal one. This one had its face carved out, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin, and on the back of its neck, there was something scrawled in faded red letters. I see you. We ran back to our cars in the morning, barely stopping to pack up. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching us. And then, as we passed the last turn before the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the mannequin. Still watching. We'd been hiking all day, the weight of our packs growing heavier with each mile. Our goal was to reach a remote part of the forest where we could set up camp away from all signs of civilization. By the time we found a clearing to set up for the night, the sky had begun to darken. We quickly built a fire, spreading out our sleeping bags and gathering around to eat. The trees stood tall and dense around us, casting long, twisting shadows that danced with the firelight. It was so quiet that even the smallest rustle seemed loud, the forest pressing in on us from all sides. As the night wore on, our laughter and conversation faded, replaced by the quiet sounds of crackling wood and occasional night birds. It was peaceful, at least at first. Then we began to hear a distant noise, a slow, dragging sound like something being pulled through the underbrush. We all went silent, staring into the darkness, but the noise quickly stopped. Probably an animal, I thought, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to brush it off, we resumed talking, but every so often, we heard it again, a dragging, shuffling sound, inching closer each time. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing, just empty woods stretching into darkness. We told ourselves it was a deer, or maybe some fallen branches shifting in the wind, but then we heard something new, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from deep in the woods. It was faint at first, like the sound of a branch hitting a tree, but it was too steady, too deliberate. We listened, each of us trying to figure out where it was coming from, but the tapping seemed to circle us, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern around the clearing. My friend suggested we head to bed, so we each retreated to our tents, trying to ignore the unsettling sounds. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding. Just as I was starting to calm down, I heard footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They stopped just outside, and I held my breath, not daring to move. Then came a scratching sound along the outside of my tent, As if fingers were dragging across the fabric, I stayed frozen, listening, hoping it would stop. Then came a whisper, low and gravelly, barely audible. "Let me in." My heart stopped. The whisper was right outside my tent, close enough that I could feel the breath through the thin fabric. The footsteps started up again, shuffling away from my tent and toward my friends. I could hear them stop. Then the same scratching, the same chilling whisper, soft but distinct. "Let me in." I wanted to yell out, to warn him, but my voice caught in my throat. The footsteps moved to the next tent, the scratching and whispering starting again. One by one, it went to each of our tents, as though it was trying to pick us off, one by one. Then silence. I lay still, straining to hear, hoping it was over. Suddenly, there was a loud crash right outside my tent. Something heavy slammed into the ground, and the whole tent shook. I clutched my flashlight, barely breathing. Then came a dragging sound, as though something was being pulled right past my tent. It was close, too close, just inches away from where I lay. In the silence that followed, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just a fraction, shining my flashlight into the clearing. I nearly screamed. Lying in the middle of our campsite was an old, tattered doll, its face cracked and smeared with dirt, one eye missing. The doll's head was tilted at an odd angle, staring directly at my tent. We all scrambled out of our tents, each of us staring at the doll in shock, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It hadn't been there when we set up camp, and none of us had brought it. My friend grabbed a stick and poked it, but it didn't move. He kicked it toward the edge of the clearing, and we all stood in tense silence, waiting to see if anything happened. We decided to put out the fire and move our camp a bit farther down the trail, away from whatever had left that doll in our clearing. We packed quickly, our flashlights casting wild shadows as we made our way through the trees. The silence was thick, broken only by our hurried footsteps, but just as we reached a spot that felt safe, I glanced back down the trail. There, at the edge of the firelight, was the doll. It was standing upright, leaning against a tree, facing us directly. Its remaining eye gleamed in the darkness, watching as we froze in horror. And then it moved. The doll raised one arm, reaching out toward us, and that gravelly voice filled the night air again, but louder this time, more urgent. "Come back." We didn't wait to see what happened next. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached the road. None of us ever spoke about that night again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in my room, I can still hear that whisper, "Let me in." We'd set up camp by a quiet lake, surrounded by trees that stretched up like towering giants. We were far enough from any civilization that it felt like we were in our own little world. We had the usual setup, a campfire crackling in the center, tents scattered around, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filling the air. The night had fallen swiftly, and we were all sitting around the fire, laughing and talking. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the forest. It was peaceful, almost a peaceful. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It wasn't the usual rustling of wind or the chirping of crickets. This was something else. A strange noise echoed from deeper in the forest. At first, we all looked at each other, trying to place it. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. It came in short bursts, then stopped, only to start again, this time closer. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My friends noticed it too. One of them, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees, but we saw nothing. The dragging sound continued, but now it was getting more erratic, more frantic. It sounded like whatever was out there was in a hurry. "Maybe it's an animal," one of my friends suggested, but I could tell from the way he said it that he didn't believe it. No animal moves like that. The air seemed to grow colder. The fire crackled and popped, but it didn't provide much warmth against the chill that had set in. We all huddled closer, unsure of what to do. Then the sound stopped, as abruptly as it had started. There was only silence now, but it felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting just outside the edge of the firelight. We tried to brush it off and return to our seats, though none of us could truly relax. Then, another noise cut through the quiet, closer this time. The same dragging sound, followed by what could only be described as a low, guttural moan. It sent a shiver down my spine. Jake, clearly on edge, stood up again, shining the flashlight towards the woods. We all held our breath. The beam of light moved across the dark trees, illuminating nothing. But just as Jake was about to lower the light, something caught his eye. At the edge of the trees, there was a figure standing. A tall, thin silhouette, almost blending with the shadows, except for the faint, eerie gleam of eyes that shone back at us. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The figure didn't move, but I swear I could feel its presence pressing in on us, like it was waiting for something. The air felt thick, like it was charged with static. We all stood, frozen in place, not daring to make a move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the woods. No movement, no sound, just gone. We stood in silence, processing what we'd just seen. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. We were deep in the woods, miles from any help. What if we were being watched? What if something, or someone was waiting for the right moment to strike? But after a long pause, Jake finally spoke. "I think we should head back to the car." Now, it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, and we all agreed without a word. But when we started to pack up our things, that's when the real horror began. We hadn't noticed it before, but there were footprints around our camp, not animal tracks, but human ones. They were fresh, the kind that would only appear in the soft dirt after a rain. And they circled our camp, getting closer with each round. That's when we all heard it. The sound of something heavy dragging along the ground, this time directly behind us. My heart raced. We turned around, and for the briefest moment, we saw it. A pale, gaunt face peering out from behind a tree, its eyes locked on us. But when we blinked, it was gone. We didn't hesitate anymore. We grabbed our gear and ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The dragging sound followed us, growing louder, like whatever was chasing us was just a step behind. We didn't stop until we reached the car, but as I sat there, trying to calm my breath, something gnawed at me. We had been so focused on what was chasing us, so terrified of what we had seen in the woods, we didn't realize that the thing we had been running from was already inside the car. I turned to look in the back seat, where I had left my bag earlier. But it wasn't just my bag that was there. There, in the reflection of the window, was the same pale face we'd seen in the woods, its eyes wide and staring directly at me. I'll never forget the smile that spread across its face, just as the car door clicked shut behind me. We were deep in the forest, miles from any town or road, camping under a sky smeared with clouds. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. The fire crackled in front of us, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends. No big deal. But by the second night, something had changed. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees, but I noticed something odd. There was no sound from the forest. No chirping of crickets, no rustle of small animals, just silence. We were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing, when we heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy landing on the ground just outside the campsite. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something large. But then there was another thud, and then another, each one growing closer. My friend Sarah's eyes widened, and she stood up. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied. "Maybe it's just an animal." But it didn't feel like an animal. It didn't sound like the usual forest noises. The thuds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't until the fourth thud that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, trying to peer into the shadows, but the trees swallowed everything beyond the reach of our firelight. "Stop it. It's probably just a moose or something," I said, my voice shaky. But Sarah was already backing away, her eyes wide with fear. "No, it's not. I think someone's out there." I laughed it off, though I couldn't deny the unease crawling up my spine. Then, just as I was about to call out to my friend Alex, the thud stopped, complete silence again. We stood there, tense and still, listening for anything movement, a voice, a crackle of leaves. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and the wind had died down completely. A few moments passed before Alex, trying to lighten the mood, grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light flickered through the darkness, illuminating only the trunks and branches. We all watched nervously, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then the beam of light landed on something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another tree, but as the light held steady, I realized it wasn't. It was something standing. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its shape was blurry at first, like something distorted in the light. I could make out its outline, a figure hunched forward, something almost human, but not quite. It was hard to say whether it had legs or not. It was like the light didn't want to touch it fully. Alex's voice was barely above a whisper. "What is that?" Sarah gasped, stepping backward into me. I could feel her heart racing. Before I could react, the figure suddenly moved. It wasn't a normal movement. It wasn't human. It was fluid and jerky at once, as though it wasn't used to walking, or maybe it was floating. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted back to the fire, adrenaline making my legs feel like lead. We could hear those unmistakable thuds following us, but they were faster now, closer, almost like something large and heavy was running right behind us. I didn't dare look back, not even for a second. We scrambled to our tent, breathless and panicked, trying to lock it as fast as possible. We threw ourselves inside and zipped the door shut, hearts racing. But, as we huddled together in the dark, trying to catch our breath, something strange happened. We heard a soft, unmistakable sound of voice. It was a whisper, so quiet we could barely hear it over the pounding of our own hearts. "Let me in." The voice was faint, distant, but it was clear it was coming from outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I knew we were alone. There was no one else out there. "Let me in," it whispered again. This time, I heard it clearer. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Suddenly, the tent began to shake. It was subtle at first, then harder, as if something was pressing against the fabric, trying to get inside. My friends froze, wide-eyed, as the whisper grew louder, now frantic, desperate. "I'm not alone," it said, the words dripping with cold venom. "I'm never alone." "But you will be." The shaking stopped as abruptly as it started, and there was a long, horrible silence. Then, just as quickly, the tent zipper violently jerked open from the outside. I watched in horror as the door pulled back with impossible strength, but there was no one there. When we finally mustered the courage to leave the tent, the fire had gone out. The clearing was empty, the trees stood silent, and the wind had returned. But one thing was unmistakable: the footprints. They were large, leading away from the tent, disappearing into the forest. A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house were creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in," I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank. I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped, The voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it, who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually, but the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before. But there they were, deep, jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others, and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again. Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement, just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Let me in. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor, leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was too large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the grind. My friends and I rented a secluded cabin in the woods, far from civilization, expecting nothing more than fresh air and quiet nights. What we got was far from peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when we unloaded our gear. The cabin looked like something out of a horror movie, old, with peeling paint and a crooked porch. But it was spacious and isolated, and we were eager to escape our hectic lives. The first night was uneventful. We cooked, laughed, and played games around the fire pit. The woods were quiet, almost quiet. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, but I thought nothing of it. It was just the isolation. Around midnight, we decided to head inside. I was in the bedroom on the second floor, alone. The others had their own rooms, and I preferred the privacy. I could hear them talking downstairs, but their voices were soon drowned out by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was soft at first, almost like a branch tapping against the window. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more rhythmic, like something or someone was scraping at the wall outside. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed deliberate, as if it were trying to get my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up in bed, listening. It was closer now, right outside the window. A loud thud made me jump. Then came a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was close. Too close. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and pressed my face to the glass. The night was pitch black, no moon, no stars. I saw nothing, only shadows and trees. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, terrified. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I was alone upstairs, and the rest of my friends were downstairs, too far away to hear anything. What if it was someone playing a prank? But the voice sounded wrong, too low, too guttural. I grabbed my phone to call one of my friends, but I had no signal. Panic crept in as the voice came again, this time with a low, scraping laugh. I was paralyzed with fear. Should I check outside? Should I wake everyone up? I stayed still, straining to hear any sound, but everything fell silent. No wind, no scratching, nothing. I waited in the dark, my ears ringing with the silence. But after what felt like an eternity, the voice came once more, only this time, it wasn't outside, it was inside the room. I heard a faint rustling behind me, and I spun around to face the door. The door was slightly ajar, as I had left it when I went to bed. But now, the space between the door and the frame was too wide, like something was pushing it open from the other side. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I heard the scraping again, this time from the far corner of the room. Near the closet, my legs moved before I could even think, and I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and into the living room where the others were still gathered, oblivious to what had happened. I rushed in, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't speak at first, just gasping for air. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, looking at me with concern. I had heard something. Someone outside the window, then inside. I stammered. I could see that my face was pale, and I knew I was shaking. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked skeptically. "You probably just heard an animal. You're freaking out," but I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We all stayed up for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like the cabin was holding its breath. By morning, I convinced myself it was all my imagination. That morning, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. There were long, scratch-like marks on the windowsill. I bent down to look closer, and to my horror, I saw that the marks weren't made by any animal. They were human-shaped, like fingers dragging down the wood. The others didn't notice, and I didn't want to scare them, so I didn't say anything. But as we walked out, I saw the final detail, a handprint pressed against the glass from the outside, smeared with something dark. We left the cabin quickly, and I didn't look back. But to this day, I can't forget that voice, those eyes I never saw, and the feeling that something followed us out of that place. And sometimes, when the wind picks up, I swear I hear a faint whisper, calling me from the dark. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm: worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from just beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard it a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there. Nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. I never liked working late. There's something eerie about being the only person left in a building when the lights flicker and the halls echo with your footsteps. But this was a deadline I couldn't ignore. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. As I typed away at my desk, my phone had died hours ago, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. The office was supposed to close at midnight, but everyone else had left, and I was alone, finishing up some last-minute work. I tried not to think about the strange occurrences that had been happening over the past few nights. At first, I chalked it up to being tired or paranoid, but now, something didn't feel right. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than they should have been, and every now and then, I could swear I heard something, a soft tap-tap, like fingernails on a desk. I shook it off. It was probably just the building settling, the air conditioning groaning. But as the sound persisted, I started to feel uneasy. The tap-tap became more frequent, like someone was walking around the office, except I was the only one here. My heart began to race. I glanced at the door. It was shut tight, as it had been all night. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore, a loud, distinct click, like a door unlocking. I froze, staring at the door. The office was locked. I was sure of it. I checked the entrance when everyone left, but now it was open a crack, just wide enough for someone or something to slip through. I stood up slowly, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. There was no way I was imagining this. I reached for my phone, but of course, it was dead. I didn't even have a flashlight. I couldn't afford to stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door. As I stepped closer, I saw the silhouette of someone standing in the hallway. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and seemed to be staring straight at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though its face was obscured by shadows. Panic surged through me, but before I could react, the figure slowly turned and walked down the hallway, its footsteps echoing off the walls. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then the sound came again, tap tap tap, louder now, like it was walking toward me. I turned to look, my stomach dropping as I saw the figure reappear at the end of the hallway. This time, it was closer. It was no longer walking, it was floating toward me, gliding across the floor with an eerie smoothness. And as it neared, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. There was just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing continued to glide closer, and I realized I couldn't escape. The exit was too far, and the figure was moving faster than I could. But just as I thought I was about to be caught, the figure stopped. It hovered in place, and for a long moment, it did nothing. My breath came in sharp gasps, my body frozen in fear, and then I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from somewhere deeper in the office. "Why are you still here?" The voice was faint, like it came from behind a wall, but the question struck me to my core. It was not an accusation, but a statement. Why was I still here? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think of one. I just wanted to get out, but before I could move, the lights above me flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the office into total darkness. I heard the figure move again, closer now. Its footsteps were right behind me, growing louder, faster, as if it was closing in. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, silent office. I ran to the door and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I made it to the stairwell and down to the lobby. As I burst through the front door into the night air, I could finally breathe again. The next day, I went to the office early, hoping I had just imagined the whole thing. But when I arrived, everything seemed off. The lights were flickering, and the air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for me. I went to my desk, and there, sitting right in the middle, was my phone fully charged and open to a message that hadn't been there before. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Don't come back." I didn't return to the office after that. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it's still watching. And I have no idea what it wants, but I know one thing for sure: I won't be working late again. The summer I spent helping my uncle on his farm is one I'll never forget. He ran the place solo, the land stretching for miles under an ever-cloudy sky. I loved the open fields and the cool breeze that seemed to carry whispers through the tall corn. The farm was remote, with no neighbors for miles. I thought I knew every sound and shadow that came with it, but I was wrong. It started as a normal evening. The golden light dipped behind the hills as I finished up the chores, sweeping hay and feeding the goats. My uncle was already in the house, his shadow long across the barn floor as he called out for dinner. I turned to lock up the barn, the rusted hinges creaking like an old man's bones. That's when I heard a deep, guttural noise coming from the woods beyond the edge of the farm. I squinted through the twilight, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the coyotes. Their howls were sharper, more playful. This was low, slow, like the rumble of a distant, dying engine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind in the trees. The next evening, I heard it again. This time, the noise was closer, resonating in my bones like a warning. I had just finished milking the cows when the rumble came, followed by a faint dragging sound. It was as if something heavy was being dragged through the underbrush. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just some stray animal. My uncle, old and unyielding, noticed my hesitation when I came inside. "You hear that, boy?" he asked, eyes sharp under the dim lamplight. He didn't wait for me to respond. "Stay inside after dark. You don't know what's out there." That night, sleep came hard. Every time I dozed off, the dragging noise jolted me awake. The sounds of footsteps, rough and uneven, scraping along the wooden floor outside the bedroom window. My heart pounded in my chest, and I dared not move. I could almost hear it breathing, something wet and rasping, like the air after a storm. The next day, I asked my uncle if he'd heard the sounds, but he just gave me a hard look. "I've lived here my whole life," he said, leaning over the kitchen table. "I've never heard anything like that before." That evening, the noise was louder than ever. It was as if something had been waiting for me to notice it, biding its time. I crept outside, armed with only a lantern and a rusty pitchfork. The air was thick and still, too quiet for comfort. I shivered, the skin on my arms crawling as I moved toward the trees. I saw then a figure that didn't belong. A man, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs bent like branches, his face hidden in shadow. He stood motionless, just beyond the line of trees, staring at me with eyes that reflected the lantern's light like twin, bottomless pools. The ground shifted, and I realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, the earth moved as if breathing, the grass parting to reveal shapes that writhed in the dark. My legs froze in place, and I could only watch as the figures emerged, eyes wide, mouths agape, hands reaching out like they wanted to pull me in. The dragging noise roared louder, almost deafening, as one of the figures lunged toward me, its face illuminated just enough to see that it had none. A yawning hollow, the size of a fist, where its features should have been. I screamed and ran back to the house, stumbling and nearly tripping over the roots of an ancient oak. I didn't stop until I slammed the front door shut, the lock clicking into place behind me. My uncle came running, but the sounds had faded. He looked at me, concern in his eyes, but he said nothing. We sat in the dark, listening to the silence, feeling it press down on us. That night, as dawn approached, the noise came back, a low thrum like the heartbeat of the earth. But it was different this time, quieter, almost like it was satisfied. I never saw them again, but I heard them whenever I went out to the barn, a low drag and an echo that whispered, "We're waiting." And now, I know what my uncle meant when he said, "You don't know what's out there." Because whatever it was, it knew me, and it wasn't done yet. The old library was as quiet as a tomb, but that was part of its charm. It was an ancient building with towering shelves that groaned under the weight of hundreds of thousands of books. I loved it, despite its creaking floors and dim, flickering lights. It was the one place I felt truly at peace, away from the noise and chaos of the world. I'd been working there as a night custodian for months, a job that suited me perfectly. On this particular night, I was finishing my last sweep of the upper floor, the one with the old, leather-bound volumes. The air was heavy with the scent of paper and dust, and the silence seemed almost to press against my eardrums. I just rounded a corner when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone's nails drumming against a desk. I paused, peering into the shadows. The sound had come from the far end of the room, where the dim light barely reached. I should have told myself it was just my imagination, but the chill creeping up my spine told me otherwise. My heart pounded as I moved toward the noise, each step louder than the last in the oppressive silence. As I neared the sound, the tapping stopped abruptly. I stopped too, breath caught in my throat. The library was as still as before, except now I could hear my own heartbeat, echoing in the empty room. I glanced around nervously, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back. That's when I saw it. A book, on a pedestal near the window, was open, its pages fluttering as though someone had just turned them. But there was no breeze. I took a cautious step forward, eyes fixed on the book. The words written in old, spidery script seemed to twist and rearrange before my eyes, forming a sentence that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here." I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned to run, but a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. The growl came from the direction of the rows of bookshelves, the sound of something heavy moving through the dark. My mind raced as I strained to see what was there. I caught a glimpse of something dark, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. It was as if the creature was made from the pages of the books themselves, its form shifting and warping in a grotesque dance. I sprinted toward the stairs, my fingers fumbling for the keys on my belt. My heart was in my throat as I threw open the exit door, slamming it behind me and locking it as fast as I could. The growl continued, but now it was muffled, fading behind the thick, old wood. I stood there in the dark hallway, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. The echo of the creature's movements seemed to reverberate in my bones, even through the closed door. I stumbled back, barely keeping my balance, and caught my reflection in a window. My eyes were wide, my pupils dilated, but then I saw it, a shadow, dark and thin, creeping across the glass from the inside. My pulse skyrocketed as I felt an icy, bony hand rest on my shoulder. I whipped around to find no one there. The library was silent again, but I knew better now. It was waiting, watching, and it knew my fear. I stumbled toward the exit, never taking my eyes off the dark windows. That night, I learned the hard way that some places keep their secrets locked between their pages, waiting for a visitor foolish enough to read them, and I was never going back. The first time I saw the old man, I thought he was just a local, wandering through the market like everyone else. It was late afternoon, the sun a lazy disk in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and shadow. I was at the open-air market, the kind with vendors yelling about their wares, hawking everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. I always loved coming here. It was a small escape from the monotony of my life. He was standing by the flower stall, head bent, as if examining the petals. He was tall and thin, with a face creased into a labyrinth of wrinkles, eyes clouded and pale. When I caught him staring, I looked away quickly, my skin crawling. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just an old man, lonely and curious. I didn't see him again until later, that evening when I was walking home, weaving through the narrow, cobbled streets. The sky had darkened, and the street lamps cast long, flickering pools of light across the pavement. As I passed an abandoned building, I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I turned, and there he was, his pale eyes fixed on me, hands shaking at his sides. "Are you following me?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilted his head, and said something so low I couldn't make out the words, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickened my pace, heart thundering in my chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed after me until I reached the safety of the busy street where people still lingered, chatting and laughing. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he had vanished. The next day, I woke up to a strange feeling, the air in my room heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of feeling that makes you check the locks on your doors, make sure every window is secure. I told myself it was just paranoia, but when I pulled open the curtains, my heart almost stopped. There, in the alleyway just across from my apartment, the old man stood. He stared, unmoving, his eyes wide and hollow. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A rush of icy dread shot through me. I slammed the window shut, the thud shaking the walls. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I stayed home, peeking through the blinds, waiting for him to reappear. Hours passed, the light shifting from morning to afternoon, but he didn't come back. Just as I let out a shaky breath, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, frozen, and then a voice called out, "Hello. Miss. Are you okay? It's the building manager. We've had reports of strange activity." I opened the door a crack, heart hammering. He stood there in a neat, gray uniform, eyes kind but curious. I nodded, mutely, and he continued, "We've been getting complaints about someone lurking in the alley. Any idea who it might be?" I tried to speak, but couldn't. Finally, I managed to say, "An old man. He's been watching me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "There's no one out there now, but we've had similar reports for weeks. People say he appears and disappears like a shadow, never coming any closer." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who he is?" The manager shook his head. "He's been around for years. People say he's a ghost, or something worse. But he only appears to those who need to see him. Stay inside tonight, miss." I thanked him, my voice trembling, and shut the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards had me on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping at the window. Light as a feather, I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, standing in the dark, one hand pressed to the glass as if trying to push through. Before I could scream, he whispered in a voice barely audible, "You're not safe." The glass fogged up with his breath, and a shape appeared, a face. My own face, but older, withered and cracked, eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, gasping. He vanished into the night, leaving only the chill and the echo of those words. It's been years now, and I've never seen him again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right or when the street lamps flicker in the dark, I swear I feel that cold, hollow stare, waiting, watching, and I know he's still out there, looking for the next one to hear his warning. I was out on a solo hike when it happened. It wasn't planned, just a spontaneous decision to leave my apartment and get lost in nature for a day. The forest was dense and ancient, with trees so tall they blocked out the sun and leaves that whispered secrets to one another in the wind. I'd wandered for hours, passing old trails marked only by fading footprints and gnarly roots that reached out like fingers. When I found the clearing, it was the sort of place you only see in dreams: bright green grass, wildflowers peppered like spilled paint, and an eerie silence that made everything feel suspended in time. I paused to catch my breath and took in the moment. But then I noticed it, a cabin at the edge of the clearing. It was small, with a roof that sagged under the weight of years and a porch that had rotted through in places, making it look like it could collapse with a gust of wind. The place wasn't on any map. I took a step toward it, heart pounding in my chest. Why would a cabin be out here, far from the nearest trail? Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the warped door open. Inside, the air was thick and musky. Dust curled in lazy swirls in the slanted beams of sunlight. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair that moved on its own, creaking in time with the groan of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, but I could feel something in the room, something intangible and heavy. I stepped closer to the chair, and that's when I heard a faint voice, like a whisper threading through the walls. It was too low to make out, but I could feel it brushing against my ears. Then came the sound of someone shifting in the corner of the room, a scraping noise as if someone was pulling themselves forward. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just silence, deep and smothering. I was about to leave when I noticed a dusty journal sitting on a rickety table. I reached for it, the pages brittle under my fingers. I flipped through, reading bits of handwriting that had faded with time. It told the story of a family who had once lived in the cabin, a family that had gone missing without a trace. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They're here. They watch. They wait. A loud bang shattered the silence, and I jolted, eyes darting around the cabin. The rocking chair had stopped moving. In its place was a set of footprints, freshly imprinted in the dust, leading toward the window. I rushed forward, but there was no one outside, just the forest stretching out, deep and dark, with shadows that seemed to twist and coil. I turned to leave, but a shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I blinked, and suddenly the room was full of people. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped between this world and the next, staring at me as if I were the one who had summoned them. I stumbled back, heart pounding, when a hand brushed mine, icy cold and shaking. I yelped and turned to see the pale, twisted face of a child. "Help us," the voice whispered, echoing from every corner of the room. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, pressing down on me like a vice. I bolted, ignoring the splintered floorboards underfoot as I ran. The forest outside, once so welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth that would never let me escape. But I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, gasping for air and looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following. They weren't there. The woods were still, as if nothing had happened. I never told anyone what I saw that day, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that same whisper, telling me they're still waiting. The first time I saw the lights, I thought it was just my imagination. My friends and I were out on a camping trip, deep in a forest that stretched for miles in every direction. We'd set up our tents near an old, dry creek bed, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of rustling leaves. It was supposed to be a weekend of nothing but stargazing and good company. But that first night, as the fire crackled and we laughed at silly stories, I noticed the lights dot at first. They were small flickers, like fireflies, darting between the trees in the distance. I pointed them out to my friends, but they shrugged it off as some trick of the light. I wasn't convinced. The lights moved too erratically, too deliberately. I could feel my pulse quicken as I watched them dance in the dark, weaving between the trunks like something searching for prey. By the second night, the lights had grown brighter, more constant. They were no longer tiny sparks, they were glowing orbs, weaving and twisting in a pattern I couldn't decipher. They came closer now, stopping just at the edge of the clearing. I wanted to tell my friends, but when I glanced at them, their faces were pale, eyes wide as they looked past me. I turned back, heart thudding in my chest, and found myself staring at a figure just beyond the fire's glow. It was hard to make out in the shifting darkness, but it was tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and two eyes as bright as the orbs looked directly at me. They were the only thing visible on its dark form, twin headlights piercing the night. A sickening silence fell over the group. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, louder than ever in the void that seemed to have swallowed everything else. My friend, Jonah, reached for his flashlight, but before he could switch it on, the figure moved, fast and fluid, disappearing into the woods. I wanted to call out, to ask what we should do, but my voice was caught in my throat. The lights followed the figure, blinking and weaving through the trees as if they were alive, guiding it deeper into the forest. We didn't speak, couldn't. The realization that whatever we had seen was not human had settled in our bones, cold and terrifying. We packed up the tents and backpacks without a word, barely glancing at each other as we stumbled toward the path out. The night air felt different now, heavy with a static charge that made my skin prickle. The lights were still there, moving behind us, their glow growing more intense. As if they were gaining on us. The forest felt like a maze, a living, breathing thing with walls that shifted as we ran. I glanced back one last time, and in that moment, I understood what the lights were. They weren't guiding the figure. They were it. It had no form without them, no shape without the glow that surrounded it. The lights didn't just move, they hunted. We made it to the edge of the forest just before dawn, stumbling out onto the gravel road. The lights blinked and flared behind us, but they didn't come out of the woods. They paused, their glow fading slowly, like the last breath of a dying star. Then they were gone. It wasn't until later, when we recounted the night to others, that we learned the truth. The locals spoke in hushed voices about the lights of the forest. They called them the wanderers, an ancient presence that moved with the dark, searching for those who dared to stay past the sun. The experience changed us, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the nightmares that came after. Dreams of those eyes, that terrible, impossible figure that had no face and no voice, only the light that came and went, always searching. And I realized the last thing I saw before I left that forest wasn't the lights. It was a single, dark shape standing at the edge, watching, waiting for the next night.